before we jump into this episode, I'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal people, whose beautiful coastal lands I am currently looking out at the water from in Mullumbimba. We have some guests calling in as well from across so-called Australia, and we recognise that the traditional custodians of these lands are the proud survivors of more than 200 years of dispossession. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs, and continuing relationships with the land. Welcome to Somebody You Love, or The Sale of Two Titties. I'm Jenna Love.
And I'm Holly Hart.
And we're experts in disappointing our parents, breaching community guidelines, and banging the people who vote against our rights. Hello, it's Jenna here. Now, I don't have Holly with me this week, sadly, but I think I've made up for it by having not one, not two, but three guests. So I am joined today by Janelle and Carly from Decrim Queensland, who are going to update us on the Queensland sex work law reform process, which is currently underway. It's exciting and it's a little bit frightening. And I've got a little bonus mini episode coming out for you this week, which is an interview with an anonymous migrant sex worker who has agreed to share with us some of her personal experiences with the laws and licensing model that is currently in place in Queensland. So first up, I'm going to chat to Janelle and Carly from Decrim Queensland. Hello, Janelle and Carly. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us today. How are you both?
Great. It's great to be here.
Good. Thanks for having us.
I'll say our pleasure, but it's my pleasure because Holly isn't here. But I know she's cheering us on. So you're both from Decrim Queensland. Can you tell us a little bit about what Decrim Queensland is to start with?
Yeah, so Decrim Queensland is a group of sex workers that band together in 2018 to help bring about decriminalisation of sex work in Queensland.
Yeah, and we joined with Respect Inc., that's the Queensland sex worker organisation. And, we're spread throughout the state. So it's a really diverse group of people.
And so do you have the support of Respect Inc., I guess that's sort of... Yeah, you're attached.
Yeah, absolutely. We're kind of, you can imagine us as kind of operating alongside Respect. Yeah. And so we overlap with Respect, and a lot of people are involved in Respect as well. But we act autonomously and have a collective decision-making process.
So we're at a process. We're in the middle of a process, aren't we, in Queensland at the moment? Tell us what's happening in terms of the sex work laws.
So, sex workers have been campaigning for decriminalisation in Queensland for decades, and there's been a great push by sex workers, allies and lots of different organisations to get the really harmful licensing framework repealed and get rid of the laws that allow police entrapment of sex workers. Right now, we've managed to get the government to do a review of the sex work laws. That's underway, and that independent committee called the Queensland Law Reform Commission is reporting back in November. So we've all put in our submissions. We've all said that we really need full decriminalisation, but we're waiting now to see what comes out of the review process.
So I should probably know this. I'm pretty sure I should know this. What is that committee made up of, the QLRC?
So they're mainly lawyers, judges, people in the legal area, and but also a committee or a secretariat who are quite a diverse bunch of people who've seconded people from areas like workplace health and safety, health, lots of planning, etc., to look at what needs to change around the laws. We have some concerns, though, about some of the things that might go wrong in this process, and particularly as sex workers who put in a submission to the process will know, the consultation paper definitely is still talking about licensing, and which is pretty confusing for us because the biggest problem we have in Queensland is the current laws and the licensing framework itself. So we're pretty concerned that the QLRC needs to hear from all of us that the licensing framework has to go. We're also pretty worried that, like other states and territories, everybody starts off as sex worker activists really trying for full decriminalisation, and that being our objective. But we really don't want any sex workers to be left behind in this process. And the consultation paper does talk about leaving some aspects of sex work still in the criminal code, and that would mean some sex workers still criminalised. It also excludes strippers, and we're really concerned that strippers are not going to be decriminalised. It's a major campaigning issue for us right now.
Has there been some confusion about whether stripping is included in what they're covering? Or I've heard different reports. Is that me or is that them?
Yeah, no, there does seem to be some confusion at the QLRC end about strippers, and they're trying to make this, as legislators often do to us as sex workers. They're trying to make this line in the sand that divides us up into somehow different sex workers. And we've been saying back strongly that, strippers are sex workers too, and absolutely deserve the same workplace health and safety and other rights that sex workers will get from decriminalisation. The kind of strange bit about it that's pretty confusing to everyone is when the Attorney General referred the issue to the QLRC, they say that the review should cover all sex workers, whether it's legal or illegal. So all sex workers should be part of the review, and yet the QLRC is taking a different position, and they're saying strippers are not included.
So we have spoken on the show before about the differences between sex work being decriminalised and being legal and licensing models. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is currently in place in Queensland? What is the licensing model?
Yep, so we currently have a licensing framework in Queensland. So at the moment, that means that 80% of the sex industry works outside of the framework because the framework itself is so limiting. We only have 22 licensed brothels in Queensland as well, which obviously means that sex workers have an extremely limited way in which they can work. The difference between licensing and decriminalisation is the removal of police as regulators of the sex industry, and also removing the legislation from the criminal code as well. So we wouldn't have any of that within that framework itself.
Why is it that 80% of sex workers cannot work legally under this framework?
So, most people know that Queensland has a licensing framework, and that's really one part of the three pieces of legislation that create all the laws regulating sex work in the sex industry. And the result of licensing, of course, is that people who can fit into the licensing framework end up having access to legitimacy and rights, but everybody else, and in Queensland that's more than 80% of the industry, is locked outside of the licensing framework and are under police scrutiny and likely to be arrested. So the three pieces of legislation are the Prostitution Act that creates the licensing framework, and also the Licensing Authority. So it allows for boutique licensed brothels, and there's 20 of those in Queensland. But it also at the same time criminalises all other sex work business models or sex industry business models. And by that I mean escort, erotic services at massage parlours, BDSM parlours, two sex workers working together, or collectives even. So on top of that, we have a really hideous set of laws in the criminal code that criminalise most sex worker safety strategies. And by that we mean things like checking in at the end of a booking, letting somebody know where you are, the address you're going to for a booking, driving each other to an out call, or even having somebody, a receptionist, to screen your booking. On top of those criminal code laws, we also have police powers that allow police to entrap sex workers. So that's really police posing as a client deceiving sex workers into agreeing to an illegal service of some kind. And that might be, a doubles booking, right? So doubles are legal in licensed brothels in Queensland, but they're illegal for everybody else. So if you're a private worker, client rings up, they're looking for a double, no one would think twice about that, right? Because as sex workers, clients bring up and ask about doubles all the time.
And it's something that a lot of us really enjoy.
Absolutely.
Because we're able to work with a peer, we've got a friend there with us, like it's nice, we feel perhaps, I know I get a little sense of, well, there's two of us and one of them. And that's, that only goes so far, but it's a nice feeling.
Yeah, totally. And, who would, imagine having to miss out on those eye rolls and glances across at each other in the booking, right? So, totally unfair that as private workers in Queensland, we're unable to do doubles.
Yeah, so as Janelle said, in Queensland, it's legal for police to pose as clients in order to entrap sex workers. So this is obviously pretty horrific for sex workers. It means a massive invasion of privacy for us. Police in Queensland will often text or call a sex worker to organise a booking under the guise of being a client. That will often include asking things like for uncovered services or implying that is what could occur with the worker, and whether or not the worker agrees to that, the police officer can still turn up at that person's place of work and then arrest the sex worker.
And, that scenario of police engaging with you as a client is a really hideous experience because, I don't know, people work differently, but, when somebody turns up at my call and they walk in the door, I'm starting the kind of, intimate touching and, engaging with that person in an intimate way, and I'm in my lingerie and, when that person turns around after that kind of engagement and pulls out their badge, tells you they're a cop, it's a really hideous feeling. And not only do police then often charge sex workers in Queensland with a charge under knowingly participate in the provision of prostitution, a criminal code charge, they also use our money and our devices to charge us with tainted property. And they actually take your money and your phones. You might get them back later on. Some people haven't. And, it's a massive inconvenience because, of course, without your phone and, your income, it throws your week and your life out, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've made a really great point there about, like, from the second you open the door or the client opens the door, the second that booking starts, we're trying to create a safe space and an intimate space. And it may not be that you're naked or whatever, but there's a vulnerability there and there's a shared experience there. And we really, we give, no matter where you work in the industry or how you work, we give a lot of ourselves to our clients and to our work. We're there, we're a part of it. So at any point in that process, for someone to turn around and, throw handcuffs on you is just so violating. I'm so grateful I haven't had that experience. And it really, I've only worked in Queensland once. And the laws are a big part of that because it scares me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that experience of, somebody you thought was a client, a paying client, turning out to be a cop who's going to take your income and your phone and not pay you for that time. There's a question of consent, right? Because you've been engaging with that person, having consented to that activity, understanding they were a paying client. It's totally wrong. And I think when most people hear about that, they're just totally appalled that entrapment is allowed to happen in that way. But we're kind of confused about how it is happening, because even in the Act itself, it says that, decisions have to be made about whether this is, a significant crime, and somebody has to give approval for it to go ahead. Right. So we think it's part of the just really long history of problematic policing and, a culture within the police force of seeing sex workers as criminals and or lesser people in our community, which, of course,
absolutely
shit.
Yeah. I mean, is two people working from the same hotel room a significant crime? Like that's, I didn't know that. That's, interesting.
Yeah. And, just on that idea of people being able to be charged just for working in the same hotel room, it's just so obscure, isn't it? Because, how would you know, right? You've made a booking.
Well, it's not just in the same room, is it?
No.
It's in the same hotel building.
That's right. And that's because of the definition of premise or premises, which means that it would be an illegal brothel if more than one sex worker is working from that same location.
Yeah, so for our listeners, actually, I won't say the law. You would have a better grasp on it than I would. But for our listeners, what is it that two sex workers are legally not allowed to both work at the same time or
at the same location?
At the same location.
Yeah, and the location where it's actually in the same premises. The definition of premise is very broad, so even a hotel is still one premise. And you'd think it's really so silly, right, that it just doesn't make sense, not logical at all, but it's still being used. And even in COVID, we had situations where police were finding out two workers were in the same hotel during lockdown. So no indication they were working, just two sex workers in the same hotel. And police were approaching receptionists, telling them that they could actually legitimately evict the person, the two people, from the hotel. Yeah, really bad. No empathy.
We also have a lot of different legislation. So, for example, sex workers in Queensland, we can't text each other. We can't text another sex worker when a client arrives or leaves from a booking. That's actually illegal. We're not allowed to share drivers in Queensland. So if another sex worker uses a driver, it's illegal for both the driver and the sex worker to use the same driver as well.
And to be clear, it's perfectly legal in Queensland, right, for somebody to go on a date from somebody they've met online and to text a friend who also is doing online dating to let them know when they've arrived at the date and leaving the date.
Right? Yes.
That's legal, yeah. But not if there's an exchange of money involved. But could you tell us a little bit about what COVID was like for Queensland workers? Because it's quite different to my experience when we had lockdowns in New South Wales. They weren't policed. We don't have a body that polices sex workers here in that same way.
Yeah, so it was really kind of obscure during COVID for sex workers in Queensland because police took it on themselves to attempt to stop sex workers from working way before anybody was in lockdown. And, that would be, people, your listeners will know how ridiculous that is when sex workers, we're always the first ones to look out for our health. So lots of sex workers had already stopped working. But, they did things like they contacted one of the advertising platforms and told them that they would have to take down the adverts of all sex workers. And that was before lockdown. So no legal reason for that to happen, but just police deciding what a public health response would be. We were, in the meantime, as sex workers, of course, and Respect was engaging with the health department and others to ensure that, sex workers had clear information and guidelines about what to do. But, of course, police inconvenience and criminalise sex workers.
Okay, so Janelle, you've talked about there only being these 20 brothels in Queensland. Can you explain what that means in practice for sex workers?
So that's one of the things about the licensing framework, only having the 20 licensed brothels, that, if there's only one brothel in your area, then if you're not having a great time at that workplace or don't like the conditions or are unhappy with the way the boss is operating, there isn't any opportunity to, like there is in other places, to just go down the next suburb and get a job at a different location, right? And of course,
definitely.
in a lot of areas of Queensland, there is no licensed brothel. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Queensland's a bloody big state with a lot of big cities, and there's 20 across the whole state. I mean, that's really not very many.
Yeah. And so that's kind of how we all end up operating, right? That 80% of people operating outside of the licensing framework. A large number of us are working as private sex workers, but some of us also work in massage parlours. And that's an area that's heavily policed. So that's usually police identifying somewhere through adverts and then going along posing as clients and, getting evidence that you are offering some extra services. And, it's quite common in Queensland for massage parlours to be, for a raid to be done. Interestingly, often the owners and operators don't get charged, but the individual workers do. And we've had some big raids recently in Queensland that are really problematic and end up with all the individual sex workers charged and, money being taken and phones, devices, etc. taken. And of course,
Classic.
For lots of us working in massage settings, right, there's lots of reasons why you might choose to do that. For some people, it's because you can, decide on what services you want to offer and not offer full service to everyone who comes in. For other people, it's because, you can have a lot of control over your working hours if you're fitting around childcare stuff. And of course, it's not always a 50-50 cut situation. So you can actually end up with a bit more for each booking working in massage settings. So there's lots of reasons to do it, but police, for however they've managed to do this, I'm not sure, but they really frame massage parlours as places of exploitation, and it's simply not the case. All workplaces all work, right, can be exploitative, and that's why we need decriminalisation. But it's certainly not true the way that massage parlours in Queensland are framed as being, having worse working conditions than other places.
Yeah, look, that's my reasoning when I worked in a massage parlour was for that first reason mostly, was that I could decide who I offered services to, whether I was comfortable, all that sort of thing. So, I mean, for me, that question of exploitation in that environment is pretty absurd, because the very reason I was doing it was that I didn't feel that I had to do anything I didn't want to do. And that, so, but logic isn't, they don't love logic, do they?
No, and yeah. I mean, that's it, right? Queensland laws, there's nothing logical about them. Talking about illogical, imagine being a small business owner providing a service, yet you're not able to describe your service in your advertising. Completely obscure, and, why would you not be able to do it? But, yep, that's the case in Queensland.
Particularly in a service where there's a huge amount of consent boundary setting involved. Like that, if anywhere, it should be prioritised that you can explain, what happens and what doesn't happen, and that you can negotiate that sort of thing beforehand. That's where it should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it gets in the way for lots of sex workers, and really that's kind of the stepping off point for police and charging sex workers. Often it starts with them reviewing the adverts and seeing something that's, outside of the guidelines, which, let's face it, right, nobody can really work within the advertising guidelines in Queensland. And so we're all stepping outside of it frequently. But if they see your ad, then it allows them to get permission to, do an undercover sting, and then you're likely to end up with one of the other charges. Because also most of us are operating, we're making that decision every day, right? about whether we work legally or work safely. And if you choose to work safely, then you are, you're at risk of being charged.
As you were saying, like when they go through your ads and that's kind of the first step in the process of being entrapped, it's also worth noting that a lot of the time you won't know that your advertising isn't compliant until you receive a fine in the mail. And that could be potentially months since your advertising has been up. So you could have been breaching numerous times without that knowledge and no one actually informs you of that. Also really important to note that the PLA actually repealed the idea that you were able to check your advertising compliance with them in 2018. So when you have the organisation or the board that is setting those guidelines and they won't even tell you if your ad is compliant, how are you meant to check that? And again, it's something being phrased as guidelines is open to interpretation.
Yeah, right. So it's not clear exactly what you can and can't say or show. Is that correct?
So there are some circumstances where it is pretty clear. So, for example, using the terminology massage, but there are examples in the guidelines, about referring to bodily fluids, for example, and they use the example mistress pee a lot. And that's actually stated in the guidelines. So when you're reading a document that's meant to be very official and you're meant to cut and dry, know what you're supposed to say or not say, but you can't check it. And those are the examples that you've been given, which is completely out of the realm of what most sex workers would even consider saying in their advertising. You have no leg to stand. So
all you know is, well, I can't say mistress pee a lot, but...
Yes, so I can't say mistress pee a lot, but maybe that means...
that was going to be my big break, mistress pee a lot.
That was going to be my working name.
It's taken. It's a bit of a pun, Oh, damn it. I don't think we've talked about this on our show before, and I think a lot of people outside of the industry don't realise that sites that scrape our ads are also a really big problem. And so if what's put out, and this is, so these sites will take some of our pictures, they might take our copy, they might not put the two together, they might take somebody else's pictures and our copy and put them together or whatever, and to try and populate these sites to try to get them more popular. And we have no say in it whatsoever, and we don't often know that they're out there. And they can say, and I've come across ads that have advertised things that I don't do and have said certain things about, put me in locations that I'm not in states I'm not in. And so if I could be potentially fined for an ad that somebody else has put up for me that I had absolutely no say in, I mean, it's a bit absurd. It's a whole other issue, of course, but it just compounds that for workers in Queensland.
I think that also comes back to receiving a pin in the mail. You might not have any idea that advertisement exists. And then months later, you could be receiving a fine. And so you either have the option of paying that fine or going to court to fight that fine. And when it comes down to those two options, especially being outed as a sex worker, which is a massive risk of going to court to fight that, and as well as legal costs and everything that's involved with that, it's a lot easier to just pay the fine.
Yeah.
And so you're stuck in that kind of position where you can't actually fight for your rights or fight for the fact that isn't yours and that it was taken and reworded. Instead, your only option essentially is to pay the fine.
Yeah.
And, on those pins, Carly, it's the case, right, that it doesn't even say what you've, anything about what you've done wrong. Yeah. It just says you've infringed the act.
So you've got
you don't even know. Yeah.
And so then you can't then fix it. You'll just keep getting the fine.
No, and your only reference is to refer back to the guidelines that you can't check.
Wow. Just ridiculous.
Why is safety illegal for sex workers in Queensland?
It makes no sense to me, but it's true.
It's illegal to work in the same building as another sex worker.
It's illegal to hire a receptionist.
It's illegal to check in with another sex worker when your client leaves.
It's illegal to use a driver that another sex worker uses, and my boyfriend cannot be my driver.
It's illegal to share overheads or work in pairs.
It's illegal for me to text a friend my location.
We all want to be safe at work.
Stand with sex workers against harmful laws that make our safety strategies unlawful. Respect Inc. is a non-profit, peer-based community organisation focused on protecting the rights, health and well-being of Queensland sex workers.
For more information, go to www.respectqld.org.au.
So with this whole licensing framework and these multiple codes under the Queensland law, obviously, that's going to make sex workers not super keen on the police, right? And so what do you see in the work that you do and in the people you've spoken to, and from your own experience potentially as well? How do you see sex workers interacting with the justice system?
So most of the time it's complete avoidance of the justice system if they can. A lot of the time people will contact Respect as an organisation or other sex workers on how to go about approaching police. So that's to report crimes like that are quite horrific, so sexual assault, rape, all sorts of things, and as well general things, so breaking and entering, any kind of crime that anyone else in the general population would like to report. For sex workers, they have to go through a whole bunch of different things and questioning whether that's something that they want to do because of the risks. And it has happened. We have seen it. This isn't, fictional risks that we are just kind of making up that could happen. A lot of sex workers have on their police files that they are sex workers, whether they have said that or not. A lot of police talk quite voyeuristic with their questioning, so very unnecessary things, especially regarding sexual assault. And if you have just been, gone through a situation where you've been violated, having someone asking those personal questions, which are just out of interest, and it's not anything to do with evidence collection, you're being violated all over again. You also have to, you potentially have to out yourself depending on the crime as well. Sex workers are entrapped after reporting crimes. There's so much that goes on with that. It's insane. It's horrible.
So because if you go and report a crime, then the police and in that process have to out yourself as a sex worker, then the police are aware that you are a sex worker and you potentially can be putting a target on yourself. Yeah.
And so, for example, say that you have gone in to report a crime and that police officer has put on your file that you are a sex worker, even if that's related to the crime or not, that can be brought up by other police. And I've seen it happen with sex workers that have been pulled over for, RBT lines and things like that. Their license had been run, so they would do more tests, like drug testing and things like that as well, because of the stigma of being a sex worker that's associated with their name on that database now.
And so this system that, I assume there are people who are telling us that it's to protect sex workers and it's to protect everyone, is really preventing sex workers from having access to justice. Yeah,
massively.
Yeah. And so we did, recently Decrim Queensland did a survey of 204 sex workers, and it really highlighted the ways that police avoid taking reports from sex workers. There were lots of examples of sex workers attempting to report crime and being laughed at or treated so badly that they didn't go ahead with the report, or police just saying, I don't see what the crime is. You're a sex worker. You've brought it on yourself. So major barriers to reporting crime, failure by police to act when reports are received. And as Carly has outlined, just that kind of stigma being placed on sex workers with every engagement with the police. So as a result, sex workers are very reluctant to have any engagement.
It's funny the way we I know I have a tendency sometimes to downplay things like that for myself. And, a few years ago, I had to go to the police to deal with somebody online who was harassing me. And I always talk about that experience as generally a really positive experience with the police, which is primarily, I'm incredibly privileged in that space. I went in with my husband. So this white man and woman walked in so very hetero-presenting, very normal, quote unquote, whatever, and I did. And I secured an AVO and I did generally have a good experience. But just when you were talking, Carly, about like the inappropriate questions, when I had to sit there and go through everything, this first police officer I had was great. The second one asked me, do I offer anal? Do I like anal? Do I, and that had literally, it couldn't be further from what was related, and I still talk about that experience as being, as far as it goes for sex workers, a pretty fucking good interaction with the cops. And it's like that wasn't, and thankfully I wasn't coming to that from a recent trauma. But I shouldn't have had to have that. And that's, that really should be the bare minimum, that I shouldn't have to deal with shit like that. And obviously, I preface all of that by saying how privileged I was in that experience, and that other than that, it was pretty fucking good. But it's just not good enough.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing in Queensland, I guess. How the sex work community works, right, is, we all share those stories. So people hear about each other's experiences with the police. And so, yeah, I literally think, hardly any sex workers in Queensland would report crime under this current situation, because you just hear weekly, right, of people having really bad experiences and being treated really badly. And at the same time, you also know that police are targeting you. Like every time you pick up the phone, it might be a cop on the other end when you're trying to, make money, earn an income like everybody else.
I think also a good story that's actually a good example of this is a sex worker that did report a break and enter into her property, and it was an old client that ended up stealing her money from bookings earlier that day. The officers that attended actually said there's nothing we can do because sex work is illegal in Queensland. And she was working by herself, following all of the legislation absolutely perfectly, and they knew so little they thought it was completely illegal, so they refused to act on her being robbed.
When I went to the police station, one of the first things, the first police officer I dealt with, he said, "Oh, sorry about my ignorance, but is sex work legal?" And I was like, you tell me, buddy. And obviously I schooled him. But I don't even know. And, and of course it's not as big an issue because they're not actively policing it. But you're talking about people who are actively policing it and they don't even know what the bloody laws are.
I think that kind of shows how much stigma we have to go through and how much of that is actually carried in, from movies and media and things like that, especially from America, where people in Australia don't even know the basic legislation on it.
Absolutely.
But isn't that just so often the case that sex workers are the experts on the laws, right? And, I guess it just takes me back to the law reform campaign. If only people recognised how much sex workers were the experts on what the laws are, what needs to change, and what's a really bad idea about changes to the laws. It'd be so much, cut out so much wasted time.
So one of the big fears, right, is the people who are going to get left behind. Who are we worried about being left behind?
So street-based sex work is currently criminalised in Queensland, but over the last 5 years there have only been 6 offences under the public soliciting charge. And that's partly because our street-based sector is quite small. A lot of people having moved to other ways of meeting clients, but it's also because they have lots of other ways of criminalising sex workers, right? So if you look at the stats, the police stats, it shows over years most of the offences were related to public soliciting, and then at some point it just totally flips over to this other charge called knowingly participate in the provision of prostitution, and that's the one that most sex workers are now charged with. So in our opinion, it's police just kind of finding the easy pattern and then just sticking to it and just doing a repeat with sex workers and, getting the easiest charge possible. So we're worried that the QLRC process won't recognise the need to decriminalise street-based sex workers, and they're framing it as, they might need to keep laws or criminalisation in place in order to prevent, public amenity impacts or on the public, right? And but if you think about the number of charges there have been in the last 5 years, right, 6 in total across the whole state, and clearly that's not a lot of impact on the community, and probably,
and it all comes back to stigma, doesn't it? It comes back to this idea that street-based sex workers are standing in the middle of the park, taking their clothes off and calling out for clients, or something ridiculous, which is just not actually what's happening.
Absolutely. And, also kind of seeing street-based sex workers as different to the rest of the community, rest of the sex work community, right? And also not recognising street-based sex workers as part of the general community. It really annoys me that bit, because it's a kind of lots of sex workers do a bit of street-based work, a bit of other work. We all move around in the industry quite a bit. So it's not as if people who are currently doing private work didn't at some point do some street work. Absolutely. Or when your rent's due and you haven't made enough that you don't do a street work job. So, yeah, we're really worried that, that part of our community will be left behind. The other part of it is in Queensland there are loitering and move-on notice laws that will use quite a bit. And we hear from other organisations that they're often also used against Aboriginal women and trans women. And so there is, in the consultation paper, the QLRC is talking about maintaining those laws as well, which would be a real problem. It would just keep the police in our lives and in women's lives and trans women's lives as well.
Definitely. And it's all well and good for them to say, well, we're not arresting sex workers because they're sex workers, but they can continue to do that under a different heading.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah. So on that, Decrim Queensland obviously put in their submission. A bunch of other orgs and individuals have put in submissions as well. And where do we go from here? What's next for this?
Well, we're really hoping that everyone hearing this will be fired up and as angry as we are, and ready to, come out fighting once should anything bad come out of this process. Because what we think we'll probably have to do is a fair bit more education. So we've got a lot of webinars and workshops lined up over the last few months of the review process to hope that the QLRC and others will listen to sex workers and hear about, why we want the laws changed and, follow through with getting rid of licensing and removing sex work from the criminal code, plus getting rid of the police powers. But should that not all go to plan, then we want everyone out there to be ready with us to, take action and make sure sex worker voices are heard in Queensland to say, no, we're not taking second best. We're not just having some little rejig of licensing. We're not going to leave any other sex workers criminalised. We want the full deal. We need full decriminalisation for sex workers to see even our basic human rights, workplace rights, legal rights, health rights, and have safety in our work.
So, of course, we in our show notes, we have links to Decrim Queensland's social media, which they do a great job of. They have infographics and sort of break stuff down so it's a bit more digestible. So totally check those out. Obviously, keep an eye on it as the year goes through. Is there a intended date that it's supposed to? I mean, it will probably be pushed back, I imagine, but
QLRC are meant to report at the end of November 22.
We shall see. Cross everything in the meantime. I know our listeners will. They're legends. Thank you for joining us, Janelle and Carly. Got all of our fingers and toes and bits crossed, and we look forward to hopefully really great outcomes.
Thanks so much, Jenna and Holly, even though you're not there. We love the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Jenna and Holly.
Thanks. So stay tuned for our bonus episode where I'm speaking to an anonymous sex worker who is a migrant worker based in Queensland, and she tells me a little bit about her personal experience interacting with the laws in Queensland as they currently are. Thank you so much for joining us this week and for making it right to the end of the episode. I know that the legally kind of episodes are not quite as juicy, probably not as many laughs, but they are really, really important. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all about here. We want to get the laws changed and the culture changed. So it's a big part of it. So thanks for sticking around. I want to thank our patrons, our even more generous somebodies, Lachlan, Timmy, Steve, our footstool. Holly isn't here, so I'll say it's my footstool this week. James E, Scott C, our secret admirer. I'll say it's my secret admirer. Thank you. Andrew, Adam Smith, Leslie, Ellen, Sub London, Scott Watson, Miss Billy, Nora Knightley, Wheezy, Fritz Your Tits, Mr. E, Brandon, Simon, Alfie, Greenie, Ophelia Parker, Aaron and Nomad, and our extremely generous somebodies are Sergio, Josh, Wombat, Adam Moore, Brino, Sienna Saint, Andrew, Pete, and Aaron. Thank you so much. I think you're all legends. Have a good one. Bye. Please look out for us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. Our name everywhere is Somebody You Pod, as in podcast. Our Patreon starts at just $3 a month, and you can get all of our episodes ad-free and a day early, plus bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes action, bloopers, and more. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the voices of sex workers. And remember, somebody you love might just be a sex worker.